Leslie de Galbert, you are going to be our Zurich lecture speaker in 2026 in October. And the title of your work is The Alchemical Mind, Carl Jung, Tibetan Buddhism, and Francisca Varela. Uh, but first of all, let's get a picture of Leslie. Who are you? Who is Leslie de Galbert? Where do you come from? What's your background? Just say a few words, please.
Okay, thank you, Mary, and good morning. And thank you to everybody in Zurich for this kind invitation. I'm very excited. So who am I? I am Leslie, and I come from the United States originally. I was born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana, where I lived until I went to college at 17 in Virginia to a small women's college that is now a university, and wanted to study philosophy. As a troubled teenager, I thought philosophy had a lot of answers. I quickly learned that it doesn't, but in my freshman year, I had a philosophy professor. We all had to take a humanities course, and probably sensing what was behind my desire to study philosophy, I did a short term with him, and he gave me Jung's Memories, Dreams, Reflections to read at 17, or just after my 18th birthday. So there was a seed planted there that was there. It fell back. I went to my college, had a wonderful program in Paris. So in my second year of college, I came to Paris. It was a 12-month program with a 12-week study trip through Europe, all the way through Eastern Europe to Russia. So I really got a sense of the wide world out there. Went back and finished college and wanted only to do one thing, come back to Paris, which is what I did. So since the age of 21, I've lived in France and become French and have a French family. And after a few years, discovered that when you run away from home, you don't run away from anything. So I found an analyst in my late 20s, and that was a very fortuitous, synchronistic, what can we say, another foreigner who spoke several languages. I by then spoke French. And we began in French, which was sort of a screen language for me by then. So it nourished my interest in bicultural, bilingual, multilingual questions. She was not really Jungian, she was Freudian, she was Swiss German. So it was a broadening of my world again. And soon I went back to university to study in very Freudian France, but with a deep Jungian attraction. So that's
Mhm.
essentially who I am.
Well, you're American, you're Parisian, and you're very interested in the East. And that's what your lectures are going to be about, Tibetan Buddhism, the Dalai Lama, and your connection and interest in things of religion and things of particularly Eastern religion. Can you say a word about that? How did you come into that area, and what stimulated your interest in Tibet and the Dalai Lama?
Exactly. Religion had always interested me a lot. Opposites have followed me through my life. I had a Protestant father, a Catholic mother, very Catholic. And in the Deep South, we had African Americans who raised us with their own religious expressions. So I was early on very interested in that. And in college, I studied Eastern religions. Philosophy and religion go together in most universities, probably still today. So I had studied Buddhism. And when I came to Europe, I've always loved to travel, and with my husband, we traveled in Buddhist countries, and we walked. We took treks in the Himalayas, and we saw the villages, we saw the monasteries in Bhutan, Nepal, Burma, even Japan, which is not Tibetan, of course, a different. And Jung and Tibetan is very, very different, and my leanings went towards Tibetan. But what really sealed that for me was, and this is why Francisco Varela is in here. So should I say a little bit about why he's here?
Yes. Who is Francisca Varela? That was a new name to me. So can you just say a word about that and how that's linked to Tibetan Buddhism and the Dalai Lama?
Absolutely. That's really my connection to what we're both intellectually but also existentially. So Varela was a Chilean biologist, and well, I'll skip to the end before telling you how I know his work. I know his work because he became the life partner of the only other American in my university program in Paris when I was studying clinical psychology. There was one other American. It was a French institution, of course. We were all speaking French, and it was a little lonely in there. And Amy and I became very fast friends. She's also a psychoanalyst, and she became the life partner of Varela. So before I knew his science, I knew him. But his science, his life is absolutely extraordinary because he was a very young and brilliant student in biology who was interested in philosophy. He read the phenomenologists, the European philosophers. He spoke several languages. And when he entered the lab of Humberto Maturana in Santiago, he wanted to study the psyche of the world. And Maturana told him, well, you've come to the right place, but first you'll have to study the visual system of the frog's eye. So he became a famous biologist with Maturana. But this theory that is in the book and that I'll explain in the lectures led him to a theory of cognition and to the mind and to consciousness. So his interests were very broad, and he from autopoiesis in biology, he went to inaction in cognition and consciousness. And then, as had happened to Jung, a trauma early in his life, Varela had to flee Chile after the coup d'etat, and he found refuge in the United States. His world crumbled. He had thought science could answer all of his questions, and he discovered that he didn't understand anything about the coup d'etat, opposites, all of the above. And in Boulder, Colorado, he met a Tibetan teacher who, one might say, well, who opened a path for him to something besides science and to the spiritual life that was inside of him that had not been lived yet. So this became part of his life as a scientist, and it wasn't just something that he did. It was something that got him back on his feet in a similar way that Jung got back on his feet through his confrontation with the unconscious. So it was a spiritual path.
This is a link between biological science and the science of the mind, or the spirit, the spirituality, and the body, science of the body. That's fascinating that he made a connection that's very current. Many people are interested in this topic today of how is the brain and the mind and the body connected to the spiritual aspect of ourselves. And that brought him to Tibet. Is that how?
Well, there's a link. There's always a link, and it's always these synchronistic events that happen in life. So Varela, after he found his spiritual path, and he really took it very seriously. He found a teacher in Nepal, and this was totally integrated in his life as a scientist. They were not separate; they were together. So he was lecturing one day in Austria in 1983, and now we'll go to the Dalai Lama, His Holiness. His Holiness was also exiled in 1959. He had to flee his country. He had had a similar experience and he discovered the suffering in the world. The Dalai Lama before, in the Potala Palace in Lhasa, was the spiritual leader and even the secular leader, but he didn't live in the world. He loves to tell the story of how he always was interested in science. So once he flew, he found his home in Dharamsala, saw the world, he believed very much that the world needed more spirituality, it could be a path to reduce suffering in the world. And he started inviting scientists to teach him Western science. He believed that Western science could enrich the science that is in Buddhism.
So he's trying to link East and West. Also, the Dalai Lama is very involved in this dialogue between East and West that we're focusing on.
Deeply, deeply involved. So he attended a lecture in Austria where Varela was speaking, and they were seated next to each other at lunch. And the Dalai Lama I'm sure that he felt something immediately in Varela, and they became almost immediately intimate friends. The Dalai Lama came to France soon afterwards to speak in the National Assembly, but he wanted to go to Varela's lab, where he went to Varela's lab and said, "You must come to Dharamsala to teach me science." Well, Varela had a busy life and said, perhaps. But with an American entrepreneur, they began a plan for a dialogue in 1987, and that was the beginning of the Mind and Life Institute.
The Mind and Life Institute. Now, you're very involved in that too, Leslie. How did you get, and what was your first meeting with the Dalai Lama like? I mean, you've been
Well,
with
my
him a
first
number of
one,
times.
so 10 years went by. I had a very busy life. 10 years went by, and there was not a place for depth psychology and psychoanalysis in these meetings. They were interdisciplinary, very interdisciplinary. There was a psychoanalyst in the first meeting, but it sort of went over flat. But Amy and I both knew that we had a place there. The reason it wasn't active was because psychology and depth psychology is part of the Abhidharma. It's part of the teachings. The unconscious is part of the definition of consciousness in Buddhist epistemology.
Yes.
So we had to wait a long time. And Varela unfortunately passed away in 2001, but Mind and Life has lived on very, very actively. And a few years later, I think it was 2010, Amy said to me, "You must come with me to one of these meetings in India." So the first time I went was 2010. It was not in the private residence of His Holiness. It was in Delhi, but it was an experience that one never forgets, being even in an auditorium when His Holiness walks into the room. It's very, very special.
Yeah.
So I listened for 3 days or 5 days, I can't remember. And I kept hearing Jungian ideas in what I was listening to. So I was astonished, I was happy, and I was invited back. I was invited back to the private residence the following year, and the Red Book had just been published.
And that's when you took him the Red Book. That's
In my enthusiasm, I said, "Can I do this?" And Amy says, "Well, we'll ask." And so I carried it all the way to Dharamsala, which was not easy. And I had a succession of people to whom I had to request this audience because His Holiness stayed in the coffee breaks he was incredibly engaged in the discussions. And it was on
I've seen the photographs, which we will show in a moment, and he looks very interested in your showing him the pages of the Red Book. His face lights up. He's very curious.
And he was actively engaged. He said he knew Martin Browen. I had written a page to give to him in case I wasn't able to have this audience. And I was telling him that Martin Browen, he says, "Oh, yes, I know Martin Browen."
Yeah, that's right.
He knew of Jung's work. So it was very exciting. It was very exciting.
Now, you're building a bridge between East and West, this bridge building. Can you just say a word about what is involved in building a bridge between Jungian psychology and something like Tibetan Buddhism? How is that engaged?
The hardest part is getting past the legitimate objections. And Jung is very articulate in the difficulties of actually integrating. And I was reading Henry Corbin this morning, and he also explains in detail why these practices cannot be bridged between East and West. What I'm proposing, and I do it through biology, I do it through the body-mind relationship, the dualistic, both East and West have dualism and non-dualism in their understandings of the body-mind relationship. But I think that if we want to, we can concentrate on what allows the dialogue and the understanding and the participation. Having known Varela and having seen how his life was integrated these things, it's a question of belief. You write a lot about belief in one of your books. And if one believes that these bridges can exist, then there is an opportunity for more understanding, for less suffering, for more peace. And that's what we work on.
Wonderful, and alchemical. Your book is titled "The Alchemical Mind." Is this dialogue that you're talking about? Are you thinking of an alchemical process involved?
Your question really caught me when you asked me that, because I realized I hadn't explained it at all. It was so obvious to me why, and so I'll tell you why. Because I almost ignore. To me, Jung has two wings that brought aloft analytical psychology. One is Buddhism. on the epistemological side, and the other is alchemy on the body-mind side, the embodied part of what we're doing in analysis. And we have this body that we have to deal with, and this work with that I do with Mind in Life really enriched my practice, because in analysis the body is an object, whereas in alchemy the body and the mind are there together, and so I called it the alchemical mind, because for Varela, for me, in his definition of cognition, which leads to consciousness,
Mhm.
it includes the body with the mind, and alchemy does that. Alchemy doesn't forfeit one or the other, and it's got a history. It's timeless. It's like the unconscious. It's always there. So to me, the mind, it was important. It was important to give body to the mind in my title. But I did ignore, even in my book, I ignore the marvelous evolution for Jung. He psychologized both Buddhism and alchemy, but he needed to do that to build analytical psychology.
Yes, Jung was a great interpreter. He interprets almost everything he picks up. And I think that's what you're doing too. You're bringing together two worlds, two disciplines, interpreting them, building a bridge. And we're certainly very excited here in Zurich to hear about the results of your research and your studies and your thought. You're right on the theme that we're really focused on these days here, bridging East and West. So thank you very much for accepting the invitation, Leslie. And we're going to be anticipating great things when you come here in October
Thank
2026.
you, Murray. The best I hope for is a lot of dialogue.
Yes, we will try to provide that. Thank you.
Thank you, Murray.